Welcome to Biblical Theology Today. I'm your host, Jud Davis. When we open Genesis, we encounter a garden. When we close Revelation, we encounter a city. For many readers, these are two different locations, a prehistoric sanctuary and a futuristic metropolis. But what if the divinely intended canonical intertextuality, and I want to just introduce this term, what I'm calling DICI. What if that's telling us that those two places are the exact same plot of land? Today we're exploring the profound plot symmetry of the Bible, and we're arguing that the Garden of Eden was always canonically intended to be understood as the site of Jerusalem. Through the DICI framework, we'll see that the Bible isn't a story of relocation, but it's a story of reclamation. We'll examine in this podcast how the Law of Jubilee actually demands this geographical continuity, how the prophets envision the return of Edenic rivers to Zion, and why Abram's call in Genesis 12 was actually a homecoming. Now, I want to just make clear here that this podcast is an AI collaboration. I'm Jud Davis. I'm professor of Greek at Bryan College. I'm also the adjunct professor of Hebrew at Birmingham Theological Seminary. I have always really liked computer tools, and I am very much exploring the possibility of using AI in service of the church. It's my understanding that whenever you do that, you need to disclose what you're doing. I'm doing that here with this collaboration disclosure. And I want to point out that this phrase, divinely intended canonical intertextuality, I did not come up with that phrase, but when I began to upload my notes to Microsoft Copilot, to Google Gemini, and to Claude Anthropic, all of these began to suggest that where my approach to biblical studies fits in with the current academic setting is that I'm arguing for a divinely intended, so this is a God thing, that it's within the framework of canonical interpretation, and that the idea of intertextuality and a divinely intended intertextuality is actually what I'm arguing for. I do thank Claude Anthropic for the terminology and the abbreviation DICI. And so I want to make this disclosure right off the bat. These aren't my ideas, but the presentation of these ideas have been amplified by AI. And so I want to just mention that up front. Now, when we're talking about the location of the Garden of Eden and where it was in terms of the canon, there are really 6 maps that kind of define this discussion. And I've included 3 of them here in this slide. So this is, I think, Phil Alexander's article on Eden, and this is what the text presents: one river splitting, forming, going from virtually unknown rivers to the river that's so well known, it just says it's the Parat River, the Euphrates. Now, what I'm arguing for is actually a view that's hinted at in Currid's ESV Study Bible Atlas. And notice in the Atlas, he adds from the Study Bible, ESV Study Bible in 2001, he adds the possibility that Eden perhaps is meant to be connected with the Promised Land. And that's what I'm trying to argue in this podcast and the articles I'm writing. So why would a Hebraist as competent as John Currid decide to add a third possibility? Well, I think I know why he wanted to add it, because it's so much better explanation than what Calvin and the Geneva Bible suggested in 1554. This is the map. I think it's the earliest one. I'm used archive.org to find this, and you see this map is the area in the Persian Gulf, and see how he's put Cush and Havilah. And I believe Calvin's position was maybe the Garden of Eden was somewhere like on this island, and that's how you understand the four rivers. And you can see that 6 years later, it's not the same map. If you look carefully at the details, this is a redrawn map, but clearly this map was looking at Calvin's map. You can see that the idea of Eden at the Persian Gulf was introduced by Calvin. Barry Beitzel has a wonderful history of interpretation on page 99 of the Moody Atlas, where he goes through these. But today, a lot of people will either put the Garden of Eden here or put the Garden of Eden here. And that's when people make suggestions for the Garden of Eden, it's usually these two. And notice, if we go back to the ESV Study Bible, you see how that's mimicking this in the ESV Study Bible, but Currid is looking at the possibility of Eden being in the land flowing with milk and honey. And that's what I want to argue for in this podcast. And I want to use the idea of divinely inspired canonical intertextuality to make that point. So what we're arguing is this, that the Garden of Eden was always canonically intended to be understood as somehow connected with the site at Jerusalem through the DICI framework, the divinely intended canonical intertextuality. We'll see that the Bible isn't a story of relocation, but it's a story of reclamation. We'll examine how the Law of Jubilee demands this geographical continuity, and how the prophets envision the return of Edenic rivers to Zion, and why Abram's call in Genesis 12 is actually a homecoming. So part 2 of this podcast, the DICI and the lens of canonical symmetry. So to understand the where of Eden, we have to look through the lens of a divinely inspired canonical intertextuality. This isn't just about finding random similarities. It's about recognizing that the divine author has woven, quote, a geography of holiness throughout the canon. Now, in this, there's a sanctuary link. And if I can just take myself out here. In the Pentateuch, the description of Eden and the tabernacle/temple are nearly identical. Notice that in Eden there's gold, there's bdellium. We really don't know what bdellium was. We just know the spelling of it in Hebrew. Bdellium is how it comes into English. But we're told that gold, there's bdellium, there's onyx, and they're found in the area connected with Eden. Well, notice in Exodus 25 and the description of the temple, and remember this temple ultimately is going to move around until it finds its permanent home in Jerusalem and rebuilt as the temple. Notice the things that are there. There is acacia wood. That's a result of the fall. Much of the furniture is made out of thorn wood, acacia wood. Notice there are onyx stones there. Notice there's gold there. And notice cherubs are there. So what we have is cherubs guard the entryway to Eden, and cherubs guard the entryway to the Holy of Holies. Well, it begs the question, does it not? Is somehow the temple in Jerusalem connected with the original location of the Garden of Eden? When Adam's exiled, it's cherubim that guard the entry to the east. Of course, the temple faces east. When the high priest enters the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem, he passes through a veil embroidered with cherubs. And recall that there's a mountain motif. I don't think I have the verse here, but Ezekiel 28 explicitly calls Eden the holy mountain of God. And of course, that's Jerusalem, Mount Zion. So through this divinely intended canonical intertextuality, we see that the temple wasn't a new idea. It was, in fact, a remembrance project designed to mimic the original mountain of God in Jerusalem. Now, what that means is, and here you can see we looked at gold and onyx, and it is interesting that manna, we don't know what bdellium was, but we're told that manna looks like bdellium, so it's the exact same word there. Manna looks like bdellium. And if you remember that inside the Ark of the Covenant, there are three things: Aaron's staff that came back to life and bore fruit, the copy of the divine law, and then a jar of manna that looks like bdellium. And so when we're told that gold, bdellium, and onyx are part of Eden, and then we read the whole story that gold, bdellium, and onyx are connected with the temple, that would be a reason, would it not, to at least explore Currid's idea that perhaps the Garden of Eden is connected with this land flowing with milk and honey, this land where you don't have to work to eat. Now, what we have then would be plot symmetry. If Eden and Jerusalem are connected, notice how much of the text that would explain. You would have Genesis in the beginning being on the mountain of Eden. You have New Jerusalem, which in the end of this story in Revelation, we're told the tree of life is in Jerusalem. Well, would this not function as a macro chiasm? There are so many chiasms in the Bible. Would you expect, would you not expect that the Bible would be governed by a macro chiasm? Well, that would be true if Eden and Jerusalem are connected. You've got the tree of life there. You've got the tree of life at the end. Of course, Jesus is coming to the tree of the cross, and Moriah means the bitterness of the Lord. Why is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem called the Lord's bitterness? Well, could this be the reason? Thorns and thistles are introduced by the fall, and then you have a crown of thorns and no more curse. So is this idea somehow part of a macrochiasm where all of these things are building on each other? This is why the location of the cross matters. If Jesus is the last Adam, as the New Testament claims, he doesn't just die anywhere. He dies on the very plot of ground where the first Adam fell. It's interesting, he wears thorns. Adam claimed to be the true king when he pushed God aside and he decided to be his self-lawgiver. Is it not plot symmetry that the God-man, the same God who gave the laws, the triune God incarnates in the person of God the Son, always that complexity where always within the unity of God there is this unstated Father, Son, and Spirit, but that triune God is incarnating in the person of the Lord Jesus. Well, wouldn't that be massive symmetry if Jesus is dying on the same place where the first Adam, or near the same place where the first Adam sinned? Now, another point that I would make that often isn't brought up in this discussion, but it's the Law of Jubilee. So you have this law in Leviticus 25 that if someone loses their property through debt, or if they sell their property, if somehow their property falls into the hands of another, there's a way for that exact exact property to be restored. So why does the location have to be the same? Well, look at this Law of Jubilee in Leviticus 25. Under God's law, if a man loses his nakhelah, his inheritance, then Jubilee mandates that exact same land be returned to the original family. And what I'm arguing then is that God follows his own laws. God had given the land flowing with milk and honey, the land where you didn't have to work to eat, and humanity lost that garden. That garden was our ancestral inheritance. The Jubilee principle requires that God restore that specific land. Now, if heaven is just a different dimension, then the Jubilee law is unfulfilled. And it does seem to be that God is in the canon, is keeping track of Jubilees, and that things happen to the very day. I didn't put the slide in there, but you're probably familiar. They go free to the very day that the oppression started in Egypt. God seems to have some kind of macro typology, typology in history with the 490 weeks. Well, would that not argue that this Jubilee, where the exact land goes back, would that not be fulfilled if Jerusalem is somehow near the location of Eden? If the New Jerusalem is the restoration of the garden on the side of Zion, then the legal debt is settled. So this view under the idea of a divinely intended canonical intertextuality, a DICI, that would make perfect sense. Now, when we come to Genesis 12, notice what the text says. Now, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I'll make a great nation of you. I'll bless you and make your name great. Now, in Hebrew, that's your Shem great. And you can probably hear the interaction with the Ham, Shem, and Japheth story just a couple of chapters before, and the people trying to make a Shem for themselves at the Tower of Babel. Well, you can try to make your own name great, or God can make your name great. And God is saying to Abram, I'm going to make your Shem great so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you. And I wish I had the Hebrew text up here. I don't, but I'm pretty sure that bless there is a PL. I will massively bless you. I will intensely bless you. And the one who dishonors you, who belittles you, I will curse. And in you, all the mishpachot, all the families, all 70 nations that were listed in the Table of Nations just a few chapters before, all the mishpachot of the earth shall be blessed. And so you have this coming to Abraham. He doesn't earn it. He didn't deserve it. God has given this to him by grace. But the question that very few people ever ask is, how does this promise of a land, this land that I will show you, to the land that I will show you, how does that promise relate to the land that was lost just 9 chapters before? In terms of literature, would you think that the land that was lost would be connected or be unconnected to the land that was promised? And those who, say things, like the flood, obliterate. Well, if that's true, why are the exact words used? Why is it the exact word for the Euphrates? Why is it the exact word for the Tigris? That the flood destroyed it. That seems like a great argument, but it's a argument that is just thoroughly ignorant. I've never talked with anybody who's even read through the Hebrew Bible even once who tried to pass off that uninformed view. It simply doesn't work. What does work in terms of the literature of the Bible and the canon of the Bible itself are all of these pointing to a divinely intended canonical intertextuality. And if you ask under that framework, where's Eden, the answer is crystal clear. Eden is somehow connected with Jerusalem. Now, you say, well, Jud, is there anything in the Bible that would suggest that's the case? Well, there are lots of stuff in the Bible that would say that's the case. This is we might call a hydrology of hope. Restoring the rivers of Eden. That's what I'm going to call this. So there are 4 main texts, and it's interesting. I've done several of these videos over the years of Eden, and a lot of people have interacted, and they've, said, "Oh, the Eden is in the Philippines." There must be somebody who's teaching that somewhere on earth, because a lot of people have said that, and Eden is different places. Eden can't be known. But none of the people who've ever posted those questions in the comments, none of them have ever interacted with these Hebrew texts that connect the location of the Garden of Eden. And, I would just say very kindly to those people who are doing lectures on this and who just pound the pulpit and say, we can't know. Listen, go watch a lecture on Dunning-Kruger. That's what's happening here. You can pound the lecture, but it doesn't change the fact that you've never even read the Hebrew Bible one time. Look, if God has given you all that kind of money, take 6 weeks off and learn Hebrew and start studying. I don't know, maybe it'll take you longer than 6 weeks, but I mean, 30 weeks, certainly you could get to the place where you could start reading a half page, and the Hebrew Bible is only 1,600 pages long. My goodness, how can anyone justify teaching on difficult questions if they haven't even taken time to read through the Bible in the original language even once? So sorry, I'll get off my soapbox there, but if you do read these texts in Hebrew, the connection with the Garden of Eden in all these texts are clear. Psalm 46, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. Well, ask, what is the city of God? I mean, isn't that Jerusalem? And is there a river in Jerusalem? And are there streams? Like, what is this talking about? Isn't this talking about the restoration of Eden's original language? Joel 3:18, and I think it may be 4:18 in Hebrew. I know the numbers are a little off, but that text talks about living waters. Zechariah 14:8, I think, talks about, in the Septuagint, a pege, a fountain. And so you have this image of if you think back to Philip Alexander's Eden drawing, you have that language being picked up here. And anybody who's even spent 2 hours in biblical theology, I mean, just get Beale's work or T. Desmond Alexander, anyone, you begin to see that this is Eden language. And even higher critical scholars are saying, yes, Ezekiel is using glorified Gihon language. Well, Gihon is the little stream outside Jerusalem. But in these texts, this has turned into the restoration of the Garden of Eden. If I would just encourage anyone who's going to post something in the comments, at least look those texts up in English. I hope you're fortunate enough to have a friend, maybe a pastor or a Jewish friend that you can go to and just say, is this Eden language here in Hebrew? And if it is, we have to ask the question, well, how does this relate to the question about the original location of the Garden of Eden? And I didn't put it on here, but when John writes in Revelation 22, seeing the river of life flowing from the throne in New Jerusalem, he's seeing that we might say the plumbing of Eden has been turned back on. These aren't 3 different rivers. It's the one river of God restored to the one mountain of God. And so if you're going to, speak as an authority on the Garden of Eden, hey, maybe get to where you can just even read through these sentences once in Hebrew, and then, and if you can't do that, maybe be a little more circumspect in rejecting what. My goodness, people have been making some of these points for 1,500 years. So I would encourage you on that front. Now, if we come to our final thoughts, the Bible is a story of a king reclaiming his territory. From the first page to the last, the divine author has been pointing us toward a specific mountain. When we understand divinely intended canonical intertextuality, so this is DICI, when we understand that, we'll realize that we aren't waiting for an escape to a distant heaven. We're waiting for our homecoming to a garden city. Every sacrifice in the temple, every drop of blood shed by Jesus on the cross was about reclaiming that exact land we lost. Now, my name is Jud Davis. I thank you for joining me on Biblical Theology today as we trace the footprints of the Creator back to our original heavenly home. Now, in the description for this video, I've listed a link to a study guide for questions if you want to explore more of this. And as always, I'll look forward again to talking together next time.